And greetings, friends. This is Peter Salemi, and welcome to another Bible Misconception program. I was watching some videos on YouTube just recently, and I came across a video from a person who is an ex-Worldwide Church of God member. And he talks about the subject of British-Israelism. He made this video, and he talks about why he doesn't believe in British-Israelism any longer. And he makes some points, he makes some arguments in this video that I want to go through with you in this broadcast. Now, these arguments are nothing new. We've seen these arguments before, and this is why we have an argument section on our website, the British Israel Church of God, britishisrael.ca, and you can check it out on our website. But I thought I would go through some of these arguments that he makes in this broadcast to show you that these arguments are just not valid. Now, let's go through the first argument that he makes in this video. Take a look at this clip.
But if you know anything about history, you'll know that British-Israelism makes absolutely no sense. Let me tell you why. First of all, the lost 10 tribes were never really lost. According to what we know from archaeology, after their defeat at the hands of the Assyrians, the vast majority of the northern kingdom's population simply migrated south and joined the kingdom of Judah.
All right, so the first point he makes is that archaeology shows, now notice there's no source that he cites. He doesn't even put up the source on the screen. He just says, according to archaeology, when the Assyrians came in and defeated the northern 10 tribes, the vast majority of them all migrated down to the kingdom of Judah. And of course, at that time, the kingdom of Judah was Judah, portions of Benjamin, and of course the Levites, of course, were scattered throughout all of Israel. So part of the Levites as well. And he says that the vast majority of them migrated down to the kingdom of Judah. Is that what archaeology shows us? Now, he doesn't cite any sources. I could show you just one source here from Ancient Records of Assyrian Babylon by D.D. Lucenbill, page 292. This is what the Assyrian records say. The king of Assyria says this: the border of Bit-Humira, which is what they called the land of Israel, they named it after, the Assyrians called the land of Israel after their king Omri. Bit-Humira, the land of Humira, the whole land of Naphtali, the land of Bit-Humira, all of its people together, I carried off to Assyria. That's what the Assyrians say. The king of Assyria said he carried the whole population away into Assyria, which is what the Bible says in 2 Kings, the 17th chapter. Verse 5, it says, the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. And in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Hala and in Harbor by the river of Gozan in the city of the Medes. Then a little later on in verse 18, it says, therefore the Eternal was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. And there was none left but the tribe of Judah only, the kingdom of Judah. And then it talks about how Benjamin was a tribe lent to Judah. So here we see Judah was left, and then Benjamin, portions of Benjamin stayed behind. And then in verse 23, it says, until the Eternal removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants the prophets, so was Israel carried away out of their land, out of their own land, to Assyria unto this day. So the Bible plainly says that the northern 10 tribe house of Israel got carried away, and they stayed there, and they never returned. And even the Jews know this. Notice what Josephus writes. And this is in the 1st century AD. He says, the entire body of the people of Israel, talking about the 10 tribes, remained in that country, the country of Assyria. Wherefore, they are but 2 tribes, that's Judah and portions of Benjamin, in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, subject to the Romans. That's the Jewish diaspora in the Roman Empire, in the Middle East. While the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now. That's, of course, 100 AD. And are an immense multitude, and not to be estimated by numbers. First century Jews knew that the 10 tribes were in their homeland, in their new homeland of Assyria. They were a huge multitude, and there they were between the Black and the Caspian Sea. The Jews knew it, but this person claims that no, archaeology, I don't know what source he's citing, says that the vast majority of the Jews came down, the vast majority of the house of Israel came down and joined the kingdom of Judah. And it's simply not true. Now let's go to the next point that he makes.
This is why the southern kingdom's population suddenly exploded at this point, and why the priests living in Jerusalem at that time started to compile, write, and edit what would eventually become known as the Torah, or the Pentateuch. Although the details are still being worked out, biblical scholars have known for well over 200 years now that the so-called 5 books of Moses were not actually written by a single author, but are rather a collection of several older documents that were edited together over time in an effort to create a unified story. And the reason why a unified story was needed had to do with the fact that what had originally been 2 separate kingdoms suddenly ended up becoming one kingdom, and the northern Israelite traditions had to be integrated into the southern Judahite traditions.
All right, so his next point is that he pretty much questions the whole history of the Bible. And even earlier in that video, he talks about the story of the patriarchs and pretty much says that it's all legend and it's all myth. Now, that theory that he's putting forth there is what is called the documentary hypothesis. Now, I'm not going to go through with you in this video the documentary hypothesis, but this book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, goes through it thoroughly and refutes that theory thoroughly. This theory was put forth by German biblical scholars like Wellhausen and others, trying to disprove the Bible, showing that we can't trust the history of the Bible. Well, Josh McDowell goes through the theory and he thoroughly refutes it. So I urge you to grab this book maybe at Amazon or maybe your local library or whatever and read it for yourself. It is not true what he's saying here about the documentary hypothesis. Let's go to the next point.
But for now, let me just say that it is clear from several textual sources that the people who lived in Judea during the Second Temple period considered themselves to be comprised of members from all 12 tribes of Israel, not just 1 or 2. Consider this verse from Ezra chapter 6, verse 17, which says, "And they sacrificed for the dedication of this temple 12 goats as a purification offering for all of Israel, according to the number of the tribes of Israel."
All right, notice the point that he makes. He says that during the second temple period, he says that the Jews believed that they comprised of all 12 tribes of Israel, even though I showed you from Josephus that the Jews believed that the 10-tribe house of Israel remained in Assyria during that time, and they were a huge multitude, and that only 2 tribes, the Jewish diaspora, was subject to the Romans and were living in the Middle East. So this is what the Jews believed during the time of Josephus. Yet he claims that in the Second Temple period, the Jews believed that they were comprised of all 12 tribes of Israel. Then he cites Ezra, the 6th chapter, verse 17. Now, isn't it interesting that he uses the Bible to justify his claim? Meanwhile, he says that the Bible is not true history, that it's something that we can't rely on. Isn't that interesting? But he uses Ezra, the 6th chapter, verse 17, that says, "And offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bullocks and 200 rams, 400 lambs, and for a sin offering for all Israel 12 he-goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel." Now, they say that's proof that all 12 tribes were there. But no, it is not. This is a sin offering for all 12 tribes of Israel according to the number of the tribes. That is not proof that the 12 tribes were there. Notice what Whelan says in his book, God's Covenant People, page 15. He says of the scripture, he says, "Why not? My father-in-law has the habit of always praying for absent family members during blessing at mealtime. Ezra was basically doing the same thing. He made an offering for all Israel, the 2 tribes present, and the remaining 10 who were absent, to verify that this was an accepted practice. Notice the text. It says here, he made a sin offering for all Israel. There's 12 tribes of Israel. He made a sin offering for all of them. 12 he-goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. It was a sin offering for all Israel, even though all of Israel wasn't even there. It was a dedication ceremony, and he was making an offering for them. And if you look at 1 Kings, the 18th chapter, verse 31, here we see in Elijah's day, he made a sacrifice. He set up stones for all of Israel, as it says, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. And we know for sure at that time that all of Israel wasn't there. It was a standard practice of making an offering for all the 12 tribes of Israel, even though all 12 tribes of Israel weren't there. So this is just a weak argument that continues to pop up over and over again, trying to prove that British-Israelism is not true. All right, let's take a look at his next point.
On top of all of this, there's a total of 0 sources and 0 archaeological findings to indicate that any of the northerners taken captive to Assyria maintained their tribal identities after that point, or that they migrated as a group to Europe. So, in short, there were no lost tribes.
All right, so this next point he makes is that there is no evidence whatsoever when the house of Israel got taken away into Assyria. There is no evidence that they maintained their tribal names, and that there is no evidence that a group called Israel from Assyria migrated up into Europe. Remember, he believes that the vast majority of the house of Israel joined Judah. He doesn't believe that they got taken away into Assyria, even though history shows that they did. Now, this so-called argument that he makes, that there is no evidence that they maintained their tribal identity, is absolute proof that they are lost. See, what he doesn't understand is that the Assyrians called the house of Israel by different names. They didn't call them Hebrews. They didn't call them Israelites. Instead, they named them after their king Omri. And you look at the Assyrian tablets and you will see that they called the Israelites the people of Omri. They called the land of Israel the land of Omri. And when they got taken away in the Assyrian captivity, that name stuck with them. And because the Israelites were taken away, they lost the knowledge of God, they lost the knowledge of the Sabbath, and God says, when that happens, you will lose your identity. And that's exactly what happened. So them losing their tribal identity proves that they are lost. And when you look at history, you will find that the Assyrians called the Israelites Bit Cumri, the Kimbric peoples, the Cimmerians, and in the Cimmerians was another group called the Scythians, and these 2 tribal groups, you can prove, migrated up through the Black and the Caspian Sea and migrated up into Europe. So there is proof that as a group, they migrated into Europe, but they had different names, different tribal names put on them by their enemies, and because they lost the knowledge of God, lost the knowledge of the Sabbath, those names stuck with them and they became lost. Let's look at the next point.
And speaking of Europe, the archaeological record is crystal clear on the fact that during the Bronze Age, let's say around 2000 BCE, which is at least 1,000 years before the fall of the Kingdom of Israel, the Celtic peoples and the Germanic peoples were already living in northwestern Europe. And we know from modern DNA research that aside from more recent immigrants, these Bronze Age peoples are the direct ancestors of those who currently live in these same areas, and of the majority of those Europeans who went on to settle in the United States and Canada. In addition to this, there is absolutely no evidence in the archaeological record or in DNA studies to indicate that a group of people from the Middle East entered this area, replacing the previous inhabitants during or after the Iron Age, which is when the so-called Lost 10 Tribes were supposedly lost. In other words, there is an archaeological and genetic continuity in northwestern Europe that is very, very old.
All right, the next point he makes is that the Celts and the Germanic peoples, which are the Scythians and the Cimmerians, the Cimmerians were known by the Greeks as the Celts. He says that these people were already in Europe when the Israelites were dwelling in the Middle East. Therefore, the Israelites cannot be the Celtic peoples. And then, of course, he cites DNA studies. However, this is an old theory that's been discarded. New studies have shown with DNA that the Celts did migrate from the Middle East to Europe. I want to show you this clip that actually proves that fact. Take a look at this clip.
Historians have traditionally seen the Celts as just another Germanic tribe that migrated west from Central Europe. But a relatively new scientific study has found genealogical evidence to the contrary. Dr. Mark Jobling from the Department of Genetics at the University of Leicester published a journal on the Y chromosomal lineages of the Celts. In this journal, the lineage of European male Y chromosomes were tested and analyzed, with DNA evidence strongly supporting the theory that Celtic men spread from a single source from the Near East, or Middle East as it's more commonly called. What is fascinating about the findings in this journal is that the route in which the migration occurred is entirely mappable. Moving through modern-day Turkey, across Europe, and in particular around the Mediterranean coastline and the Iberian Peninsula, through the Gibraltar Straits, and up along the coast of Western Europe into the British Isles, is a clearly defined path. The increases in frequency and reduction in diversity from east to west of the Y chromosome supports a rapid expansion, as a fading trail of the chromosome shows the path of migration from the Middle East to the region where the Celtic people reside today. The study estimates that the time frame of expansion was approximately over a period of 4,500 years, and that this likely happened from 7,000 BC until as recently as 2,500 BC. But regardless of the accuracy of their dating methods, the migration did occur. And there is a corroborating historical document that I would like to cross-examine with the scientific research, which may suggest a more recent date for the migration. Written in 1320 by Scottish barons and nobles and submitted to Pope John XXII, the Declaration of Arbroath is Scotland's claim for independence. The document describes the sovereignty of its people and supports Jobling's claim by describing how they came to settle in the British Isles. We know, and from the chronicles and books of the ancients, we find that among other famous nations, our own, the Scots, has been graced with widespread renown. It journeyed from Greater Scythia by way of the Tyrrhenian Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and dwelt for a long course of time in Spain among the most savage peoples. Thence it came, 1,200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea, to its home in the west, where it still lives today. These nobles firmly believed that their ancestors migrated from east to west, following the exact pattern as described in the journal on the Celtic Y chromosome. These men share the DNA evidence that corroborates their historical records.
Let me just add that some people say that because of DNA results, British-Israelism cannot be true, because we see the Northern Europeans belonging to the RB1 haplogroup, and we see the Jews belonging to the J1, J2 haplogroup, and therefore they cannot be Israelites. However, and I'll put this article up if anybody wants to look at it. This article plainly says that the length of separation, together with inevitable foreign infusion on both sides, environmental influences, genetic drift, etc., is more than enough to explain any differences that may exist between the two bodies. So to try and disprove British-Israelism through genetics is just an argument that has been disproved over and over again. Let's take a look at this next point.
On top of all of this, we also have linguistic evidence. Linguistically, Celtic languages and Germanic languages, which include English, are part of the much larger Indo-European language family, whereas the ancient Israelites quite clearly spoke a language that was part of the Semitic language family, which also includes modern Hebrew and Arabic. There is absolutely no evidence that English in any way developed from ancient Hebrew.
All right, so the next point he makes is that there is no evidence whatsoever linguistically that the Hebrew, that the English comes from the Hebrew. Now, I want to read you this. Hebrew scholars, such as Dr. Isaac Moseson, have long complained that dictionaries leave out the Hebrew derivation of words, even words with obvious Hebrew origins. Instead, giving the origin of these words as Latin, which is, of course, a branch of the Indo-European language. It says genuine language scholars now admit that Hebrew and English are related and have a common origin. You can see this from Language and Introduction by Dr. Lewis Hemsley, and of course Dr. Isaac Moseson's book, The Word, the dictionary that reveals the Hebrew source of the English. So there is proof that the English does come from the Hebrew.
Then there's the whole idea of the British royals being the descendants of the house of King David. That entire part of the theory hinges on a claim that a Judean princess escaped around the time of the fall of the Kingdom of Judah and traveled all the way to Ireland. As you might have guessed, there is absolutely no evidence that such a thing ever occurred. In fact, the earliest mention of Tea Tephi is in an 1861 book by a Reverend Glover, and it would appear that Glover simply made the whole story up. All of the Irish manuscripts that later British Israelites offered as evidence were proven to be forgeries.
All right, so he basically says here that the whole story of Jeremiah and Tea Tephi that we find in the Irish manuscripts is pretty much either all made up or the manuscripts are proven to be forgeries. Again, no sources are cited. He doesn't quote any sources. Now I want to quote you this source from The Story of the Irish Race, page 9 by McManus, and he says this basically about Irish history. He says, "Let us understand that the ancient historical legends of Ireland are, generally speaking, far from baseless myths. The Irish people are a people who eminently cling to tradition. Not only were the great happenings that mark great epochs enshrined in their memory forever, but even little events that trivially affected the history of their race were and are seldom forgotten, and that the Irish people place a tremendous value on history, recording and preserving their history." And then it goes on here to say that no person would even dare to alter the facts, the things of importance. No poet of repute, however highly he might color, could or would dare to falsify. So I just cited you a source that's saying that the Irish manuscripts is Irish history. No sources from this man. Let's take a look at the next point.
And then finally, there's the elephant in the room. What's the motivation behind the whole theory anyway? Well, the whole thing is centered on the idea that white Anglo-Saxon people living in the United States and the British Commonwealth have a special God-given destiny, and that they have been given a special birthright from God, to the exclusion of all other groups of people. So not only is the theory wrong, it's also very racist.
There it is, folks. I was waiting for it. Pull out the old race card. See, a lot of these people do this to win the debate, win the argument, and win converts to their side, especially in this politically correct climate that we live in. Is it a racist concept? Now, when people say the Jews are Israel, that's not racist. Protestants, Catholics will never say that's racist. There's a group called the Black Hebrew Israelites. They claim that they are biblical Israel. No one says that's racist. If you were to say the Japanese are Israel, or the Pakistanis or the Chinese are Israel, no one would say that's racist. But as soon as you say, because of this politically correct climate that we're in, as soon as you claim and prove that the Anglo-Saxon Celtic peoples are Israel, all of a sudden, boom, there goes the race card. And they do that, and there's a reason why they do that. I want to read you this from The War Against the Family by William D. Gardner. He says this when it comes to debating people like this. He says, "The winner of the debate becomes the one who is most offended and outraged. Or, if that doesn't work, he'll be the one who can most successfully label the opponent a bigot or a racist or a sexist. But such labels are always the first sign of a lazy mind. As we saw in this video, no sources were cited. He would just say, archaeology says, or this is proven to be false or forgeries. But no sources were cited. He really didn't look into this. He didn't really look into British-Israelism in great detail. So he'll pull out the race card and he says this is the first sign of a lazy mind. And I think we've demonstrated that in this video. Is it a racist concept? Absolutely not. God chose Israel and they are chosen. They are not favored for a responsibility to be a light to the nations, to help the heathen races of the world see the light, to be a missionary people, to help people and so on. It is not a racist concept, no matter how many times they say it. So in conclusion, I believe that in this video, we have proven, and not just with this video, but other videos and also our literature. I urge you to read our booklet, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, and go to our arguments section where we deal with a lot of these arguments that these people use to try to disprove British-Israelism. I believe in this video and in our literature, we have proven that we are the house of Israel. And I also urge you to go to another website, and I'll put the link in the YouTube player as well, called britam.org by Yair Dividi, who I had the privilege of interviewing a few years ago. And he goes through in great detail with many, many sources proving that we are the house of Israel. And it proves that your Bible and the biblical prophecies are true. This is Peter Salemi saying goodbye, friends. I'll see you here next time on the Bible Misconception program.